What if I told you there's a hidden message in the book of Exodus? A truth so powerful, so liberating, that some have tried to bury it in plain sight. This isn't just another Bible story. This is a divine blueprint, a spiritual map written in fire, blood, and freedom. And the part that no one talks about? It mirrors your life more than you realize. The oppression, the delay, the moments when you feel like God's voice has gone silent. It's all there, encoded in every chapter. And here's the twist. The real war wasn't just between Moses and Pharaoh. It's happening inside of you, right now, between the voice that calls you forward and the fear that keeps you in Egypt. In this video, we're going to uncover the spiritual mechanics behind every miracle, the reason behind every delay, and the promise hiding in every battle. It's not about religion, it's about revelation. And if you stay with me till the end, you'll walk away not just with knowledge, but with a deep spiritual awakening. So if something in your spirit has been whispering, "There's more," you're not crazy. You're being called. What if I told you that the prosperity of a people was the very reason behind their enslavement? That's right. The opening of the book of Exodus doesn't hold back. After Joseph's death, what was once a blessing became a threat. The Israelites multiplied so greatly that the new Pharaoh took notice, and not in a good way. In his eyes, their growth was dangerous. So he did the unthinkable. He turned freedom into chains. Sound familiar? Maybe you're not under Egyptian whips, but you've felt the weight of a life that drains your energy to the last drop. How often has your strength become a threat? At work, in your family, among friends? In the book of Exodus, their growth wasn't celebrated. It was punished. That tells us something critical. Sometimes suffering comes not from failure, but because you're growing beyond what the system can handle. Egypt's slavery wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. Day after day, they made bricks for someone else's kingdom. And today? So many are stuck in the same loop, building dreams that aren't theirs, suffocating their own identity. But here's the good news. The book of Exodus begins in bondage, but ends in breakthrough. And it all starts when you realize you were never meant to live enslaved. Now take a deep breath, because here's something most people miss. Oppression didn't arrive overnight. It crept in. First fear, then decrees, and finally, chains. The biggest prisons start with the smallest compromises. A toxic habit here, just this once there, until you realize you're trapped in something you helped build. Awareness is the first crack in the wall. Hold on, because what comes next might shift your entire view of resilience. The more Pharaoh pressed down, the more the people multiplied. There's something spiritually powerful in that. When the world tries to crush you, heaven makes you grow inwardly. Maybe your current pain is the soil God is using for a hidden harvest. Look closer. Pharaoh even tried to control the births. He wanted to kill the future before it had a chance. How many times does life do that to you? Ideas crushed before they bloom. Dreams aborted before they take shape. But here's a truth from the book of Exodus. What belongs to God carries a multiplying force that no human decree can destroy. Now, if you're looking for a practical way to live this out, try this. Start journaling your pain and turning it into strategic prayer. It connects you to the heartbeat of the book of Exodus, turning groans into cries and cries into movement. Read Psalm 34 out loud. Memorize it. When you posture yourself spiritually, oppression begins to break. Don't be fooled. Egypt can look like a toxic job, a controlling relationship, even a twisted version of religion. But the way out starts within. God only moved when the people cried out. So let me ask you, are you crying out or just complaining? Remember, crying out activates heaven. If this is hitting home, maybe it's time for a fast, not just from food, but from noise. For 3 days, cut out distractions and listen. Read Book of Exodus chapters 1 and 2, slowly, out loud. You'll begin to notice the story is speaking about you more than you thought. And it's not over yet. Because in the midst of all this darkness, a child is about to be born. And not just any child. This baby will carry the key to liberation in the fragile arms of a newborn. Stay with me. The story is just beginning. Imagine this: a nation drowning in despair, babies being torn from their mother's arms, a decree of death echoing through the land. This is how the book of Exodus introduces one of the greatest deliverers in human history. Through the silence of a terrified mother placing her child in a basket, hoping the river would be kinder than Pharaoh. Can you picture that moment? Her heartbeat louder than the current, her tears hidden in the reeds. Now think about your own life. How often do you feel like you're placing your dreams, your hopes, into a current you can't control? That's what Moses' mother did. But here's the twist. What she released in faith, God protected by grace. This part of the book of Exodus isn't just history. It's a manual on surrendering what we can't hold. Sometimes, our greatest protection comes when we finally let go. Pharaoh's plan was genocide, but God's plan was genius. He didn't send an army, he sent a baby. And here's the wild part. Pharaoh's own daughter became the protector of the very child meant to dismantle his empire. That's divine irony. Life will try to convince you that the odds are stacked against you. But in God's math, the smallest vessel, a basket, a child, a yes, can carry the weight of transformation. Hold that thought, because this next part is beautifully layered. The very mother who let Moses go ended up nursing him in Pharaoh's palace. Isn't that how God works? He allows separation only to orchestrate restoration. If you've ever lost something, felt pushed away or forgotten, the book of Exodus whispers, God knows how to write full-circle stories. But wait, there's a deeper message. Moses was raised in the palace of the enemy, yet he never lost his identity. And this matters, because so many today are growing up in systems that don't reflect who they really are. They wear masks to survive, speak languages that aren't theirs, chase goals they didn't choose. Yet deep down, their calling waits, just like it did for Moses. If this resonates, maybe it's time to rediscover your identity. Read Book of Exodus chapter 2 with fresh eyes. Ask yourself, what environments have shaped me but don't define me? Meditate on Psalm 139, especially verses 13 to 16. You were formed for more than your surroundings. You were designed with purpose, not permission. Let's go deeper. The river that carried Moses was supposed to kill him, but it carried him into purpose. That's a pattern. What was meant to drown you might actually deliver you. Pain, rejection, abandonment. None of these get the final word when God is involved. The book of Exodus shows us that the currents of life are often divine transportation. Feeling a stirring. Inside, good. That's your spirit remembering something ancient. Start a new habit. Every morning before checking your phone, ask, what am I being prepared for today? Write the answer. Pray over it. You'll begin to sense that your days have direction, even if they seem chaotic. If this story has moved you, consider subscribing. This isn't just a video, it's a journey. And if this moment sparked something in you, know that you're not alone. Here, we walk together toward the truth that sets us free. And it's not over, because Moses' real mission hasn't even started yet. His exile, his burning bush moment, his calling, all of that is just around the bend. Trust me, what comes next might just shake the ground you walk on. What if your biggest failure was actually the setup for your greatest calling? That's exactly what happened in the book of Exodus. Moses, once a prince in Pharaoh's palace, saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and acted on impulse, killing the man. His heart burned with justice, but his hands weren't ready. Overnight, he went from palace to fugitive. Ever felt like one mistake wiped out everything you were building? But exile has a purpose. In Midian, Moses wasn't just hiding. He was being prepared. He got married, became a shepherd, and learned the quiet rhythm of desert life. And here's the kicker. Sometimes God needs to pull you out of the noise so you can hear his voice. If you're in a season that feels like exile, maybe it's not punishment, maybe it's preparation. Then it happens. In the middle of nowhere, surrounded by sheep and silence, a bush catches fire, but doesn't burn. And from the flames, a Voice. God calls his name. Moses, Moses. The book of Exodus makes one thing clear. God doesn't need grand stages to reveal destiny. Sometimes, your holy ground looks like an ordinary Tuesday. All he needs is your attention. Hold up, because what comes next is easy to miss. When God reveals himself, Moses hides his face. He feels unworthy. Sound familiar? So many of us hear the call but run from the weight of it. We count our flaws louder than our faith. But God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. That's not a cliche. It's divine strategy. Now here's something few talk about. The call of God often feels disruptive. Moses had a stable life, family, routine. But purpose is rarely convenient. When God said, "I am sending you to Pharaoh," he was asking Moses to face his past, his fear, and his failure. What past do you need to confront in order to step into your purpose? If you're wrestling with self-doubt, go read Book of Exodus. Chapter 3 slowly. Highlight every time God affirms his presence. Then write down the excuses you've been giving for not stepping into your calling. Burn that paper, literally, symbolically. It's time to stop letting fear write your story. Let's make this practical. Spend 10 minutes a day this week in silence. Just silence. No music, no phone. Ask, God, what are you preparing me for? Listen. Write. Obedience often begins with observation. The bush was always burning. Moses just noticed. And if this message stirred you, consider subscribing. Here, we explore more than stories. We uncover blueprints for real life. If you've ever felt like you were too broken, too far, or too late, this channel exists to remind you. You're not disqualified. You're in training. Still with me? Because what comes next is nothing short of miraculous. Staffs turning into serpents, hands transformed, signs that defy reason. Moses doubts, but God insists. The reluctant deliverer is about to witness power beyond anything Egypt had ever seen. Imagine this. You're standing barefoot on holy ground. God himself just spoke to you. And your first response is, "But what if they don't believe me?" That's Moses. The book of Exodus paints a stunning contrast. Divine miracles on one side, human insecurity on the other. And who can blame him? When your past is full of failure, your future can look too big to believe. But God doesn't back off. Instead, he gives Moses signs, powerful, visual, unforgettable. A staff that becomes a snake, a hand that turns leprous, then heals, water turning to blood. Not just tricks, but messages. Proof that when God calls you, he also equips you. The book of Exodus shows us that the miraculous often meets us in moments of deepest doubt. Still, Moses resists. "I'm not eloquent," he says. "I'm slow of speech." And that's when we see the heart of God. Not angry, but firm. "Who gave human beings their mouths?" he replies. There's a lesson here. Stop arguing with your designer about your design. Every flaw you think disqualifies you is already accounted for in his plan. Hold that thought, because now comes a plot twist. God sends Aaron to be Moses' spokesperson. This isn't just a backup plan, it's a principle. You don't have to walk out your calling alone. The book of Exodus whispers a truth many forget. Divine callings are often fulfilled through partnerships. Who's your Aaron? And there's something deeper going on. Miracles weren't just about impressing Pharaoh. They were about awakening Israel. Every supernatural act was a divine wake-up call. Today, miracles might not look like staffs and serpents, but they still show up. In provision that makes no sense, in healing when hope seemed lost, in peace during chaos. Pay attention. Want to activate that in your life? Here's a practical step. Write down 3 things that seemed impossible, but happened anyway. Reflect on them. Thank God aloud. Gratitude sharpens your spiritual vision. The book of Exodus isn't just a record. It's a reminder that the supernatural is still at work, even in your daily grind. Let's talk mindset. Miracles didn't erase Moses' fears, and they won't erase yours either. But they will shift your posture. The key isn't confidence in yourself, it's trust in the one who called you. Read Book of Exodus chapter 4, and every time you see the word sign, replace it in your mind with invitation. That's what miracles really are. If this is speaking to you, maybe it's time to stop waiting to feel ready. Read Isaiah 6:8. Pray the words, "Here I am, send me." Even if you tremble, even if you stutter, the kingdom advances not through perfect speech, but through willing hearts. And if this resonated, consider subscribing. Around here, we dive into truth with honesty, courage, and the belief that God still calls the hesitant. If you've ever felt too flawed to be used, this space is for you. You're not just invited, you're essential. And stay close, because we're just warming up. Next comes the showdown. Moses and Aaron standing before Pharaoh, plagues that shake a nation, and a battle between obedience and hardened hearts. What's coming might just reframe everything you thought about justice and divine timing. What if I told you that every plague in Egypt wasn't just judgment, it was a message? In the book of Exodus, Moses and Aaron walk into Pharaoh's court not with swords, but with a word from God. "Let my people go." It wasn't just a political demand, it was a divine ultimatum. And Pharaoh's resistance would unleash a cascade of supernatural disruption that exposed the cracks in every false god of Egypt. Let's start with the first strike: water into blood. The Nile, source of life, becomes a symbol of death. Then come the frogs, sacred to Egyptians, now overwhelming. Gnats and flies infest the land. Each plague dismantles a pillar of Egypt's pride. The book of Exodus reveals this truth. When God confronts systems of oppression, he does it with precision. Not chaos, correction, but Pharaoh's heart, hardened. Again and again, he resists. And here's the twist. Sometimes God himself allows that hardening. This messes with our heads. Why would a loving God let someone resist? Because free will isn't cheap. And sometimes, judgment isn't about punishment. It's about exposure. God was revealing what was already broken. Let's pause and bring this home. Have you ever prayed for breakthrough and things got worse before they got better? That's Book of Exodus territory. Before freedom came, the plagues intensified. The people suffered. But don't mistake delay for denial. God's process often includes pressure, and pressure reveals the true shape of your faith. Here's a checkpoint of retention. What comes next can shift how you see spiritual warfare. Livestock die. People are covered in boils. Hail shatters the land. Locusts eat the remnants. Darkness swallows the sky. These aren't just punishments. They're invitations to surrender. When God repeats himself, he's not unsure. He's merciful, and yet Pharaoh clings to control. How many times do we do the same? Holding on to power, pride, habits we know are killing us. But God is patient. He sends warnings before judgment. If you're in a season where life feels like it's unraveling, ask, what is God trying to free me from? Or free through me? Practical step. Choose one area of stubbornness in your life. One habit, relationship, or mindset. Write a prayer of release. Read Book of Exodus, chapters 7 to 11. Slowly, asking, where am I, Pharaoh, in my own life? It's not easy work, but it's holy work, and here's the emotional core. The final plague is devastating, the death of the firstborn. It's not random. Pharaoh's system killed Hebrew babies. Now the grief comes home. This is justice, but it's also heartbreak. Never forget, divine justice always carries a tear in God's eye. If this chapter stirred something deep, consider subscribing. This isn't just content, it's a spiritual path. If you've ever wrestled with delay, doubt, or divine silence, this journey is for you. God doesn't skip the hard parts. He walks us through them. And stay with me, because what comes next is a turning point, not just in the book of Exodus, but in the entire spiritual narrative of humanity. A lamb, a doorframe, and a night that changed everything. Imagine a night so sacred, so intense, that its memory would echo for millennia. The book of Exodus brings us to that threshold, the first Passover. God gives strange instructions. Sacrifice a lamb, mark your doorposts with its blood, eat in haste. Why? Because what's coming will not only deliver, it will divide. This was more than survival, it was alignment. Now pause and reflect. Have you ever felt that urgency in your spirit? Like something in your life needed to shift now? That's what Passover symbolizes: readiness. God told them to eat with sandals on, staff in hand. Freedom was at the door, but only those prepared would step into it. Sometimes breakthrough comes dressed as a last-minute instruction. Then comes the midnight cry. The firstborns of Egypt, from Pharaoh's palace to the prisoner's cell, are struck down. But in the homes marked by blood, silence reigns. Not fear, covering. The book of Exodus reveals this truth. God's protection doesn't depend on your perfection, but on your obedience. The lamb didn't just save lives, it pointed to something eternal. Here's where it gets prophetic. The blood of a spotless lamb, applied by faith, becomes the line between death and deliverance. Sound familiar? The Passover is a shadow of the cross. That's not coincidence, it's divine choreography. When you choose to trust God's provision, you step into a story, bigger than your pain, but the story doesn't stop there. As the cries rise in Egypt, Pharaoh finally breaks. "Go," he says. And the people leave, not crawling, but with favor. The Egyptians, desperate for peace, give them silver, gold, clothes. This isn't just escape, it's restitution. The book of Exodus teaches us, God doesn't just bring you out, He brings you up. Now let's ground this. What would it look like to live with Passover mentality today? Start by practicing spiritual readiness. Spend one evening this week in intentional silence. Light a candle. Reflect on what God may be preparing you for. Reread Book of Exodus chapter 12. Let it speak. Let it stir. And here's something practical. Begin a habit of marking your home. Not with physical blood, but with spoken blessing. Pray at your doorway. Declare peace over your rooms. Invite God's presence to dwell where you dwell. Passover wasn't just about leaving Egypt, it was about entering a new way of living. Let me ask you, what would happen if you stopped hesitating and started trusting? The Israelites left quickly, no time to overthink. Sometimes faith looks like movement. If you've been stuck in cycles of delay, maybe it's time to tie your sandals, grab your staff, and step out. If this message lit something inside you, subscribe. This space isn't about hype, it's about holy readiness. If you felt like freedom is near but you don't know what to do next, stay close. We walk through this together, because what's just ahead is nothing short of miraculous. Walls of water, a path through the impossible. Pharaoh might change his mind, but God never will. The Red Sea is waiting, and it's about to split. Picture this. You're finally free, heart racing, children in tow, and suddenly, a vast sea in front, an angry army behind. That's where the book of Exodus takes us next. The Israelites had just escaped centuries of bondage, only to face an impossible obstacle. Ever felt like your breakthrough led straight into another battle? That's not failure, that's formation. Here's the tension. Fear begins to rise. "Why did you bring us out here to die?" they ask Moses. Sound familiar? How quickly we forget miracles when faced with the next mountain. But Moses speaks something timeless. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Sometimes faith doesn't require movement. It requires stillness. And then, the impossible happens. God tells Moses to stretch out his staff. The waters split. A wall of water on the right and the left. Dry ground beneath their feet. The book of Exodus shows us that the God who frees is also the God who makes a way where there is no way. What looks like a dead end may just be your doorway. Let's bring this home. What's your Red Sea right now? Is it debt, sickness, confusion, betrayal? Don't panic. Posture. Lift your staff, your faith, your prayer, your declaration, and watch. God doesn't ask you to part the sea. He asks you to trust while He does. Miracles follow obedience, and then comes justice. Pharaoh's army follows, but as the last Israelite steps out, the sea returns. Not a single soldier survives. This wasn't just protection, it was closure. Some of us need to know, when God closes a door, don't try to pry it back open. The book of Exodus is a testament. Not everything that chased you deserves to follow you. Here's something practical. This week, identify your Red Sea moment, that place you feel stuck. Write a declaration of faith about it. Say it daily. Read Book of Exodus chapter 14 aloud. Let your spirit hear your voice believing. There is power in the spoken word, and don't skip the detail. The people crossed together. No one ran ahead. No one was left behind. Deliverance was communal. If you're walking alone, find someone to walk with. Ask, who can cross this sea with me? Miracles multiply in unity. If this message is hitting deep, take a second to subscribe. Not for numbers, but for a tribe. A people who believe that seas still part, that deserts still bloom, and that God still leads. Because what comes next is the journey between deliverance and destiny. Hunger, thirst, questions, quails from the sky, manna on the ground. In the next chapter we discover freedom isn't the end, it's the beginning of trust. What if your dry season was actually the training ground for trust? The book of Exodus moves us into the wilderness, not as punishment, but as preparation. The Israelites, fresh out of Egypt, find themselves without food and water. Their first instinct? Complaining. And honestly, who could blame them? But beneath the hunger was a bigger question. Would they trust the God who brought them out to also carry them through? Then it comes, bread from heaven, manna. Every morning, fresh provision right outside their tents. Not too much, not too little, just enough. God was doing more than feeding their bodies. He was forming their faith. The book of Exodus teaches us that sometimes God doesn't give you abundance because He's trying to teach you dependence. And then, quail, meat in the evening, water from a rock. The impossible made normal. But here's the twist. The miracles didn't stop the murmuring. Even when surrounded by supernatural provision, the people struggled to trust. Sound familiar? How often do we forget yesterday's miracle in today's discomfort? Pause and reflect. What manna has God placed in your life that you've overlooked? The daily strength to endure, the unexpected help, the moment of peace in chaos. Start a gratitude journal. Write down 3 things each day that feel like provision. Gratitude turns wilderness into holy ground. There's also structure in the miracle. God told them not to hoard manna. Those who tried found it rotting the next morning. Why? Because fear stores what faith is supposed to trust. The book of Exodus reminds us, scarcity mindset is a leftover from slavery. Freedom requires a new rhythm. Daily, open-handed trust. Now here's something practical. Pick 1 day a week to fast from complaining. Just one. Replace every complaint with a declaration of provision. Read Book of Exodus chapter 16 as a meditation. Let it rewire your default response to discomfort. And notice the Sabbath. On the 6th day, the manna doubled. No gathering on the 7th. God was teaching them rest in the wilderness. Think about that. Even in lack, rest was sacred. You're not meant to hustle your way through the desert. You're meant to trust your way through. If this word is speaking to you, take a moment to subscribe. Here we grow together, even when the path looks dry. If you've ever wondered why provision feels scarce, maybe it's because God's teaching you where real abundance comes from. And don't go anywhere, because the wilderness isn't just a test. It's a training ground for something bigger. Ahead lies conflict, leadership, and the birth of a new structure. The next chapter? It's about battles, burdens, and breakthrough. What if your breakthrough required a battle before the blessing? The book of Exodus drops us into the unexpected. Israel is attacked by the Amalekites. No warning, no preparation, just war. Moses climbs a hill while Joshua fights below. But victory doesn't come from the sword, it comes from lifted hands. That's the mystery of spiritual warfare. What happens in the unseen determines what happens in the seen. Now imagine this. Moses' arms grow tired. Victory falters. So Aaron and Hur step in, one on each side, holding him up. Think about that. Even the strongest leaders need support. The book of Exodus shows us a powerful principle. Your posture in battle isn't just about personal strength. It's about shared burden. Here's a reflection for you. Who's holding up your arms? Who knows your battles well enough to stand beside you? And maybe even more important, whose arms are you holding up? Faith was never meant to be a solo mission. It's communal. It's covenantal. That's why you need your tribe. But the story doesn't end there. After the battle, Moses' father-in-law Jethro visits and observes something dangerous. Moses is trying to judge every case, every conflict, alone. It's burning him out. Jethro gives wise counsel: delegate, raise leaders, share the load, and in doing so, the foundation of Israel's leadership structure is born. That's a word for today. Burnout often masquerades as responsibility, but true leadership empowers others. The book of Exodus doesn't just teach spiritual principles, it teaches organizational wisdom. If you're drowning in tasks, maybe it's time to pause and restructure. Ask, what am I doing that someone else could be empowered to lead? Practical habit. Write out your top 5 responsibilities. Circle the ones only you can do. Delegate the rest, even if it's just in prayer. Begin practicing Sabbath leadership, leading from rest, not from rush. Study Book of Exodus chapter 18 and Proverbs 11:14. Wisdom multiplies when shared. And here's a spiritual truth. Sometimes battles reveal your gaps so God can build new structures. Israel didn't need a new miracle. They needed a new model. That applies to your life too. When stress spikes, don't just pray for relief. Pray for realignment. God often uses conflict to push us into clarity. If this message is resonating, go ahead and subscribe. Here, we don't just read stories, we apply them. If you've ever felt overrun, overworked, or overlooked, this space is a reminder. God sees your fatigue, and He's sending your errands and Jethros, and it's far from over. Because what comes next is the moment they've been moving toward, all along. A mountain, a cloud, thunder and fire, and the voice of God delivering a covenant that would shape history forever. Imagine standing at the foot of a mountain that's trembling, wrapped in fire and smoke, while the voice of God thunders from above. That's the scene in the book of Exodus as Israel reaches Mount Sinai. This isn't just a spectacle, it's a summons. After all the miracles, all the battles, God brings His people to the mountain not just to amaze them, but to marry them. This is covenant, sacred, binding, transformative. God speaks the 10 Commandments, not suggestions, not rules for religion, but a blueprint for relationship. These weren't given to oppress, but to protect. They show us how to love God and love people. And here's what's wild. For the first time, a nation hears the voice of God together. This wasn't about one man. It was about forming an identity. Pause and reflect. When was the last time you let God define your values instead of culture? Sinai reminds us that freedom without structure becomes chaos. The book of Exodus teaches us that divine boundaries aren't chains. They're channels for blessing. The question isn't, what can I get away with? But how close can I live to God's heart? But something deeper happens. The people are terrified. They beg Moses to speak on God's behalf. And Moses does. He enters the cloud, alone. Here's the lesson. Intimacy often requires courage. Hearing God clearly may mean facing what others fear. If you've been asking for deeper revelation, be ready to step into the cloud, and then come the instructions. Not just moral laws, but spiritual rhythms, altars, feasts, rest, generosity, justice. God isn't just building a nation, He's shaping a culture, one that reflects heaven on earth. The book of Exodus isn't just about escaping Egypt, it's about entering alignment with the kingdom. Now here's a practical application. Read the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20 slowly, one by one. Ask yourself, where am I living aligned? Where do I need realignment? Don't approach it with guilt, approach it with hunger. This is God offering a framework for flourishing. And consider this. Covenant isn't a contract. It's not based on performance, it's based on promise. God didn't say, if you're perfect, I'll be your God. He said, if you listen and obey, you'll be my treasured possession. The covenant is an invitation to intimacy, not perfection. If this stirred something in you, I invite you to subscribe. This journey isn't about religious rules, it's about sacred relationship. If you're hungry for more than surface faith, you're in the right place. Let's climb the mountain together. Because next comes the descent. And while Moses is wrapped in glory, the people below are slipping into idolatry. a golden calf, a broken covenant, but also a glimpse of divine mercy that might just change everything. Imagine this contrast. At the top of the mountain, God is engraving commandments on stone, and at the bottom, the people are melting gold to form a calf. It's heartbreaking. In the book of Exodus, this moment is the spiritual equivalent de uma traição conjugal. They had just said yes to the covenant, but when Moses delayed, they defaulted. Isn't that how many fall, not from rebellion, but from impatience? They wanted a God they could see, touch, control. So they made one. Aaron, pressured by the crowd, gives in. The golden calf rises, a symbol of regression. The book of Exodus doesn't just show us failure. It shows us what happens when we confuse delay with abandonment. Just because God is silent doesn't mean he's absent. Now picture Moses descending, carrying the tablets written by God's own hand, and he sees the dance, the idolatry, the broken vows. His reaction? He smashes the tablets, not out of rage, but out of grief. Covenant had been shattered. Ever felt that weight? When what was sacred gets trampled by those you trusted most. But here's where divine mercy enters. Moses climbs the mountain again, this time not for commandments, but for intercession. He pleads, he fasts, he even offers to be erased from God's book if it means saving the people. The book of Exodus reveals the heart of a true leader, one who stands in the gap, even when those behind him have fallen, and God responds, not with destruction, but with compassion. I will cause all my goodness to pass before you. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Yes, consequences come. The Levites draw swords, and some die. But grace remains. God renews the covenant. That's the beauty of this chapter. Even after betrayal, restoration is still possible. Take a moment and reflect. Where have you built your own golden calves? Maybe it's control, comfort, approval, success. Anything we turn to when God feels distant becomes a false center. But repentance reopens the path to presence. That's the lesson here. Not just that we fall, but that we can return. Here's a practical step. Do a spiritual inventory. Write down the areas where you've settled for golden substitutes. Then read Book of Exodus chapters 32-34. As you do, ask, God, show me your glory, even in my mess. Because that's what Moses asked, and that's what God revealed. And don't miss this. Moses' face begins to shine, not because he was perfect, but because he stayed in the presence. You don't have to have it all together. You just have to keep coming back. Holiness isn't about never falling, it's about always returning. If this spoke to you, I'd love to invite you to subscribe. Here, we don't cancel the fallen, we restore the willing. If you've ever felt like you blew your shot with God, this channel exists to remind you. Mercy still writes new chapters, and it's not over. Because now, with a renewed covenant and a radiant leader, God gives instructions that will shape Israel's spiritual identity forever. A sacred tent, a place of dwelling, a mobile holy ground in the middle of the wilderness. Picture this. After failure, fire, and forgiveness, God doesn't push his people away. Instead, he says, "Build me a place to dwell among you." That's the heart of the book of Exodus as it draws to a close. The tabernacle wasn't just a tent, it was heaven's blueprint on earth, a mobile sanctuary, a divine address, proof that God doesn't just want to rescue you, he wants to remain with you. Now let's get practical. Why all the detail? Cubits, colors, curtains, materials. Because presence has a pattern. God is intentional, and when we mirror that intentionality, our lives become places where he can dwell. The book of Exodus teaches us that worship isn't random, it's reverent, structured, and sacred. Here's the beauty. Everyone had a part. Some brought gold, others brought fabric, oils, or skills. Men and women alike were stirred to contribute. That's still true today. You don't need a title to be used by God. You need a willing heart. What's in your hands? Maybe it's time to offer it for something eternal. The tabernacle also shows us rhythm. Morning and evening incense. Candles always lit. Bread always present. It was a daily invitation to commune with God. Want to mirror that? Create a sacred space in your home. Light a candle. Play worship. Read Book of Exodus, chapters 35 to 40 slowly. Make your ordinary environment spiritually intentional. But hold on, there's a deeper layer. The ark, the mercy seat, the veil. All of it points forward to Christ. The Book of Exodus isn't just about ancient design, it's divine foreshadowing. Every stitch whispers of something greater. The tabernacle was temporary, but it pointed to a permanent presence that would dwell within us. Now here's a moment of reflection. Have you treated God's presence as a visitor or as a resident? The tabernacle required preparation, cleansing, reverence. If you want to carry God's glory, you need to make space. That might mean pruning distractions, forgiving offenses, or carving out quiet again. Practical application. Fast from hurry. Set aside 15 minutes daily this week for intentional stillness. No agenda. Just a heart that says, "Speak, Lord." Holiness isn't about performance, it's about positioning. And when you prepare, He comes. And here's the conclusion of Exodus. The cloud of God descends. The glory fills the tabernacle. Moses can't even enter because the presence is so thick. This wasn't a symbol, it was substance. A God who dwells. That's still His desire. And yes, it still happens. If this touched your heart, consider subscribing. This isn't a channel, it's a meeting place. A modern-day tabernacle where we seek His presence together. If you're hungry for more, you're not alone. Here, we build altars in the ordinary. And with that, the Book of Exodus closes, not with an ending, but with an indwelling. The journey continues, not around the tabernacle, but with it at the center. Where God leads, we follow. Where He dwells, we become whole. So now the question isn't what happened in Exodus. It's what will you do with it? You've seen the signs, the patterns, the mercy, the fire. This isn't just history. It's an invitation. God still calls the broken, still parts impossible, sees, still provides in dry places, still writes covenant on human hearts. The Book of Exodus is your story too. What chains are you still carrying that He already broke? What Red Sea stands before you, waiting for your first step of faith? What golden calf have you let steal your worship in moments of fear or delay? Don't just watch a story. Live it, because freedom isn't the end. It's the beginning of a journey, a process of trust, obedience, and revelation. And now, it's your move. What spoke to you the most? What part of this journey felt like it was written just for you? I'd love to hear in the comments. Let's grow together. If this video stirred something in your spirit, if it woke something that was sleeping, subscribe, activate notifications, and walk with us. We're not just telling stories. We're chasing presence. You're not alone. You're being led, and the wilderness is not where you die. It's where you become who you were born to be.